Hey, what's up guys, and welcome to 61 Tempest, currently the Warrior's top single target range damaging soul. Tempest is a really cool spec with some incredible burst potential, and because of that, I definitely recommend you save a roll slot for this build. In this guide, I'll show you where to put your soul points, which masteries to select, as well as how to play Tempest, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Looking at this soul tree breakdown, you see we do the full 61 points in Tempest. That is because the level 61 ability Wavelength is extremely important to this build, so you definitely want to make sure you put the full 61 points in there. For the secondary soul, we go 15 in Reaver, that's 5 in Entropic Embrace for the 10% non-physical damage increase you get there, 5 in Shadow Strength for the 10% strength increase you get there, and 5 in Plague Grip for the 10% attack power and weapon damage increase that you get there. Also, for going 15 in Reaver, you pick up Soul Sickness, which is a really strong damage over time ability, and Direct Corruption, which is also a really strong damage over time ability. For the third soul, we pick up 0 in Paragon, that's specifically to pick up Way of the River, which is a 3% crit chance buff. Moving on to the masteries, level 61, we take Resonating Strikes. This is going to allow your critical hits to apply a 3% max health absorb shield to you once every 6 seconds, but more importantly, it's going to allow your abilities to have a cost reduction of 25% during Wavelength. This is huge because before this change was made, during Wavelength, a lot of warriors would get starved and weren't able to do optimal rotation, so this is extremely good stuff here. For level 62, we take Soul Regeneration. This increases the incoming healing by 3%. Level 62 isn't too terribly important. You can select whichever one that you like the best. Level 63, we take Energy Reserves. This one allows your damaging abilities to have a 33% chance to restore 4 energy. That can happen once every 3 seconds. As I mentioned before, Tempest is a really starved build most of the time, so having this mastery selected is really beneficial. Level 64, we take Precision Strikes. This is going to allow your attack point generating attacks to place a stack of precision strikes on you, basically giving you a 6% damage increase after 3 stacks. It'll also increase the duration of your damage over time abilities by 6 seconds, so your Soul Sickness is usually a 15-second damage over time ability, now 21 seconds, and Direct Corruption is usually a 30-second damage over time ability, now 36 seconds. That's pretty good stuff there. And of course, level 65, we take Power Manipulation because it gives you a lot of free damage as well from that, as far as single target goes. If you are in a situation where you need to use more AoE than single target, you can swap up to Power Variation for an extremely strong AoE damage cooldown there as well. So that's it for the Souls and Masteries, guys. Let's go ahead and talk about the macros briefly. So looking at the macros, we have quite a few that I use for this build particularly. We'll start with the opener. This guy right here is just going to have a couple different skills in it that you're going to use for specifically just for your opener. After that, you're going to forget about this macro altogether. But what it'll do for you is it'll cast your Electricity Cascade finisher, and then it'll go into a Charge Pulse, Double Pulse, which is a staple of this build. You'll be using these two skills a lot together. And then you use a Dual Pulse, which will give you 2 attack points. And then you use an arc finisher to finish your opener. And I'll show you more about that when we get to the actual rotation section. And of course at the end we have a cast itself, Power Manipulation, and that's because Power Manipulation doesn't cost any energy, so you can cast it whenever or wherever you want. So moving on down, we have the Wavelength Macro. You'll see I have it labeled X3, X6. That's specifically to remind me that you cast Wavelength 3 times, then use your arc finisher, and then cast it 6 more times before you're going to have to hard cast. So, and again, it's just going to have your Charge Pulse, Double Pulse in it, and Power Manipulation. Moving on to the Single Target Builder Macro, we have a lot of your different pulses in here. It's going to make a large portion of this build is in one. So you'll start off, you have Charge Pulse, Double Pulse here. Again, Double Pulse is going to be off global cooldown, so it'll cast pretty much right after Charge Pulse. And then, of course, you have your Delayed Pulse, which is going to be a Delayed Pulse, a Delayed Damage ability. Dual Pulse, which is going to give you your 2 combo points. And then you have your Direct Corruption here, which again is from our Reaver tree. That's one of the damage over time fillers that we have. And then, of course, we have Soul Sickness, which is going to damage over time filler. Now, if you're not comfortable managing all this stuff in one macro, I will show you how to play the build with this macro setup here. But if you'd like to manage them separately, that is always a very viable option. It just becomes a little bit more difficult because you have a lot more keys that you have to manage, but that is completely and utterly up to you. So moving on down, we have the Single Target Finisher macro. It's just going to have your Double Pulse at the top. That's for ease of use. I'll explain that more in the rotation section. We have Arc, which is going to be your primary finisher here, and you have Skyfall, which is going to be your backup finisher as well. And then moving on down, we have a cast itself, Power Manipulation at the bottom of that one also. Moving on down one more, we have Electricity Cascade. This is going to be a really strong damage over time finisher. You can see it does just about 70k damage, and this guy's gear is not very good at all, so it's pretty good stuff there. And then of course we have Double Pulse at the top to ensure that that's going off because it's off global cooldown. And then we have the itself Power Manipulation line at the bottom. Moving up to the top right, we have the Lightning Torrent macro. This is simply just so you can put Skyfall at the end of it, because after you use your Lightning Torrent, in the beginning of the rotation in the rotation section. You use a Skyfall in the beginning, and then after that you won't use it again. So it's just there for ease of use. Again, I'll explain that more in the rotation section. So that's it for the macros, guys. Of course, I do have a K-alert set here, which is just telling the K-alert system which set that I use, which is 5 for Tempest. So pretty standard stuff there. But that's it for the macros, guys. Let's go ahead and discuss action bar. So moving up to the top left, we have enhanced connectivity. This is going to be an 8% damage increase buff. We have electromagnetic shield, which is a 10% damage buff as well. We have Way of the River, which is a 3% crit chance buff. We have Empower, which is a 5% range damage buff. We have Binding of Affliction. This is going to increase damage of non-physical attacks by 5%. And then we have Focus Fire, which used to be an active buff, which is now a passive buff that increases your critical hit chance by another 5%. Moving on the right a little bit more, we have Power Manipulation. You'll notice this has no cost. The only reason this is here is because before a fight, you'll target yourself and preload this before the fight starts. After that, it'll be completely managed by your macros. Moving on the right one more, we have Fluid Movements. This is one of the masteries at level 65. This is going to be similar to your Living Energy and also your Anthem of Fervor from Bard. It reduces the ability cost by 5%. So if you're in an expert or if you're in open world and you're using Tempest, you definitely want to make sure that you're using this mastery because otherwise you'll become very starved, energy starved. Moving over to the right, of course, we have the K-alert macro here. Down to the secondary bar, we have the Opener macro on the Z keybind. We have the Lightning Torrent macro on the Q keybind. We have the Storm Torrent macro, or actually the Stability, on the E keybind. And we have the Wavelength macro on the R keybind. Moving over to the right a little bit more, we have Electricity Cascade here. We have Charge Pulse, Double Pulse, Dual Pulse. These 4 right here are what's going to be in your Opener macro. They're just there so that I can show you the tooltips. You don't actually ever have to use them from there at all. So moving on the right a little bit more, we have Jolt. This is going to be an off-global cooldown heal. You can use this if you go into PvP or something like that. Typically, I don't use it very much, but it's there just in case. You have Light Refraction, which is going to be a warrior stealth. It's pretty cool. It's a perma-stealth. The only bad thing about it, though, is you can't move. So that's the only crappy part. Moving on to the right again, we have Disorienting Blast. This is going to stun up to 8 enemies for 3 seconds on a 30-second cooldown. Again, it's probably got more uses in PvP than actual PvE. Moving on down to the main bar, we have the single target macro here on 1. We have the finisher macro here on 2. We have Electricity Cascade macro on 3. We have Electricity Blast, which is an AoE damage over time ability on 4. You're going to be using this as a filler once in your 60-second block. On 5, we have Shock Pulse. This is just in case you lose yourself in your rotation and you don't know what to do. You can default to 5 to use Shock Pulse a few times to reorient yourself in your rotation. On 6, we have Offensive Blast, which is an AoE builder. On 7, we have Chain Pulse, which is an AoE finisher. On 8, we have Dire Corruption. You're never actually going to cast this from here. However, it's here so you can use it with your AoE abilities. On 9, we have False Repose, probably one of the cooler abilities that Tempest gets. It's just basically a feign death, so you can drop aggro. Pretty cool stuff there. On the middle click here, the 0 key, Distracting Pulse is your interrupt. On minus, we have Elude, which is going to be a break free / leap backwards 20 meters on a 1-minute cooldown. And of course, on the equals key, we have the standard break free. So that's it for the action bar, guys. Let's go ahead and talk about K-alerts briefly, and then we'll discuss how you play. So looking at the K-alerts, I only track 4. There is a couple other things that you can track if you want to, but it's not entirely necessary. But totally up to you. Feel free to create extra K-alerts for this build if you like. So we'll go ahead and hit Edit Layout. So you can see the 4 damage over time abilities here. We have Electricity Cascade. That's the one you're going to have 100% uptime on. And then we have a couple of damage over time fillers here with Dire Corruption, Soul Sickness, and Electricity Blast. So pretty standard stuff there. It's just basically timers telling you how long you have before they're off. The main one you're going to be keeping an eye on most of the time is going to be that Electricity Cascade, and that's simply because it hits so hard. So that's it for the K-alerts, guys. Let's go ahead and discuss how to play Tempest. So one thing you'll notice with Tempest is that your dummy parses can be a bit sporadic and not very consistent, and that's because of how reliant the build is on critical hits. It's also worth noting that in a raid where crit chance is higher and raid buffs are present, Tempest will scale a lot higher and your numbers will likely look a lot better than they will on a dummy, and that's just because of the nature of how Tempest plays. That said, let's go ahead and get started with this rotation. So the first thing, of course, you're going to want to do is preload your attack points. The way that you do that is you find yourself a corner somewhere away from any mobs that you can aggro, and you channel your Storm Torrent with the E key. Once that's done, you'll have your 3 attack points. You'll go back to your original position and you'll find your target, which in this case is a level 67 raid boss dummy. You'll target yourself and you'll preload Power Manipulation. Now for the purposes of this video, we are running Fluid Movements for the energy cost reduction, because if we didn't, we would bottom out and it would really screw up our rotation. So if you don't have an energy buff, then you want to swap Power Manipulation, but if you or if you do have one, you want to swap to power manipulation. If you don't, you want to use fluid movements. So that said, of course, we're going to pick our target, a raid boss practice dummy here. We're going to start out by using our opener macro 4 times. So we're going to use Electricity Cascade, Charge Pulse, Double Pulse, Dual Pulse, Arc, and then right into our Wavelength as soon as that global's done. So use Wavelength 3 times, and then the Arc on 2, and then Wavelength 6 more times. So that's 2 times right there, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and on the 6th time, now we're going to go into a hard cast Charge Pulse and immediately into 3 for Double Pulse Electricity Cascade, Q for the Lightning Torrent, Q for Skyfall, 1 for Delayed Pulse, 1 for Dual Pulse, 2 for Arc, 1 for Dire Corruption, 1 for Soul Sickness, 1 for Charge Pulse, 2 for Double Pulse Skyfall, Q for Lightning Torrent. Once that's done, we're going to go Electricity Cascade, Electricity Blast, Dual Pulse, Arc. Then you're going to use Storm Torrent for 2 ticks. And then you're going to use a Charge Pulse, Double Pulse Skyfall, Lightning Torrent, Electricity Cascade, Delayed Pulse, Dual Pulse, Arc. And now your Wavelength's going to be done, so you're going to go right back into your Wavelength Macro and use that 3 times. And then an Arc, and then use it 6 more times. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then you're starting all over again. So you can see we kind of ended up about 51, 52 there. I did a couple parses earlier, and it's usually between 48 to 52-ish, which is pretty respectable for my gear. I don't have a proccing trinket, and I have a bunch of expert crappy gear and stuff still. So, but definitely pretty good. And of course, it's going to scale a lot better in raid as well. So definitely keep that in mind. And also keep in mind we're not using power manipulation, which is good for another 1 or 2 or 3K around that area there. So, but basically it works off a 60-second block, guys. If you ever find yourself lost in the rotation for the single target, basically what you're going to want to do is mash your 1 key, make sure that your Electricity Cascade is staying up, and if you run out of fillers, you can use your Electricity Blast, your Dire Corruption, and also your Soul Sickness for fillers. So, and then once you get to have Wavelength back up, that's when you can reset your rotation again and go back into the rotation that I just showed you. So now we talked about the single target rotation, guys. Let's go ahead and talk about how you would do AoE. So dealing AoE damage as a Tempest is not too terribly difficult. One thing you want to keep in mind is that if you go to your masteries, you can swap to power variation, and power variation will be an extremely strong AoE damage cooldown for you. So I definitely recommend you do that, and then you move that thing to your bar. I typically keep mine right here. I don't keybind it because you use it so seldomly anyway, typically only on trash packs and stuff, that it's not too terribly important. But I put it right there. So after you have that guy set in your bar, you're going to target the middlemost mob, and you're going to start off by firing a Dire Corruption, 4 for Electricity Blast, 6 for Offensive Blast, then go into your Power Variation. After Power Variation is done, you're going to use your Chain Pulse, and then Storm Torrent. Once Storm Torrent is done, you're going to use another Chain Pulse, and you're going to go into your Offensive Blast spam. So you're going to keep using Offensive Blast until you get to 3 attack points, 7 for Chain Pulse, use 2 more Offensive Blasts, and then refresh your Electricity Blast on 4, 7 for Chain Pulse. And you're going to keep on going with your Storm Torrent. Should have used Storm Torrent earlier there. It's okay though. And then 7 for Chain Pulse, 8 for Dire Corruption, and 6 for Offensive Blast again. So you can see it's pretty easy to do, guys. We're still like in the high 130s or so, which is pretty respectable considering this guy has pretty terrible gear, and this is a single target range spec. So 4 for Electricity Blast, and then E for Storm Torrent. Once the Storm Torrent is done again, Chain Pulse. And keep going with your electricity or your offensive blast there. So pretty straightforward stuff, guys. Not too bad. About 4 or 5 skills. You can see it does about mid 130s or so with mediocre gear. And my gear will be at the end of the video. But that's it, guys. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps out. And I will see you guys next time.